States in the 1970s. What was it like in the 1970s? Many parts of the chaotic 1960s, particularly war and social change, continued into the 70s. Major trends included a growing disappointment in government, progress in civil rights, increased influence of the women's movement, a heightened concern for the environment, and increased space exploration. Many of the radical ideas of the 1960s gained wider acceptance and were mainstreamed into American life and culture. President Richard Nixon. Our 37th president was Richard Nixon, who became president in 1969, as you studied in the last module. He was president until 1974. Nixon's new federalism. Nixon needed to satisfy the Southern partners in his election coalition and address court-ordered busing to reduce segregation. He proposed new programs as the solution and called it New Federalism. This program involved locally controlled desegregation. Across the South, the Nixon administration established biracial committees to plan and implement school desegregation. The program was well accepted by the states, and by the end of 1970, only about 18% of black children in the South were attending all-black schools, down from 70% in 1968. Nixon's work for women's rights. Nixon also worked for women's rights. He increased the number of female appointments in his administration, despite opposition from many in his administration. He also created a presidential task force on women's rights, requested the Department of Justice to bring sex discrimination suits against blatant violators, and ordered the Department of Labor to add sex discrimination guidelines to all federal contracts. Nixon's work for the environment. Nixon had never seemed to give much thought to the environment. However, after the 1970 Earth Day, which involved 20 million people across the country, Nixon saw an opportunity and a need and pushed for the Clean Air Act of 1970. He established the Department of Natural Resources and the Environmental Protection Agency. He signed the National Environmental Policy Act and signed the Federal Water Pollution Control Act amendments of 1972. Nixon's other accomplishments. So, what were Nixon's other accomplishments? He signed the Paris Peace Accords in 1973, established the Consumer Product Safety Commission in 1972, approved the development of NASA's Space Shuttle program, and approved a 5-year cooperative program between NASA and the Soviet space program, culminating in the Apollo-Soyuz test project, a joint mission of an American Apollo and Soviet Soyuz aircraft in 1975. He also traveled to China to try and encourage peace and contact between the two nations, and visited Beijing and Moscow in 1972. One of his most famous accomplishments is that he ended the draft. Nixon and the Watergate scandal. Most of you have heard about the Watergate scandal. The Watergate Hotel is one of Washington, D.C.'s finest office/hotels. On June 17, 1972, former CIA agents and electronics expert James McCord and men working for the Committee to Re-elect the President, CREEP, broke into the Democratic Party's headquarters in the Watergate. They got caught going through the files and trying to plant listening devices. Nixon denied any knowledge of it and that his administration had played any role in it. Nixon and the Watergate scandal continued. The burglars went to trial in 1973 and either pled guilty or were convicted. Before sentencing, James McCord wrote a letter to Judge John Sirica saying that high Republican and White House officials knew about the break-in and had paid the defendants to keep quiet or lie during the trial. John Dean, a White House lawyer, told the committee McCord was telling the truth, that Nixon had known of the effort to cover up the White House involvement. Nixon and the Watergate scandal continued. Damaging information began to surface, including evidence that documents linking Nixon to the cover-up of the break-ins had been destroyed, and that the Nixon Re-election Committee had run a dirty tricks campaign against the Democrats, and that the administration had illegally wiretapped the phones of enemies, like journalists who had criticized Nixon, In March of 1974, former Attorney General John Mitchell and 6 top aides were indicted by a federal grand jury for trying to block the investigation and were eventually convicted. Nixon and the Watergate scandal continued. Nixon continued to deny any involvement, but it was revealed that he routinely made secret tapes of conversations in his office. Nixon refused to turn over the tapes at first, and when he did, it turned out that some of them were missing or had been destroyed. They were also full of profanity, which shocked people who had been completely sort of deceived by Nixon and had a different perception of Nixon. In the summer of 1974, the House Judiciary Committee approved articles of impeachment against the president for obstructing justice. On August 8, 1974, Nixon submitted a one-sentence letter of resignation and then went on television and said, "I have always tried to do what is best for the nation." He was the first and so far the only president to resign. It fell to Nixon's successor, Vice President Gerald Ford, to try to bring back a sense of order and stability to the nation. Gerald Ford. When Nixon resigned, Gerald Ford became president. He was the first president who was not elected to either the presidency or the vice presidency. He was president from 1974 to 1977. 1 month after taking over the presidency, Ford pardoned Nixon for his participation in the Watergate scandal. This caused a lot of controversy, but Ford said he did it to save the nation from the prospect of a long, messy trial. Gerald Ford continued. In 1974, President Ford offered clemency to those who had evaded the draft during the Vietnam War if they would swear allegiance and perform 2 years of public service. Furthermore, those who had deserted during the war could return for 2 years in the branch that they had left to achieve clemency. Ford was criticized by those who felt he was being too easy on the draft dodgers and by those who had avoided the service because they felt they were in the right. Gerald Ford continued. Fighting had resumed in South Vietnam, and in 1974, Ford asked for aid to be sent there, but Congress would not agree. In April 1975, the war in Vietnam ended because the government in Saigon announced its unconditional surrender to North Vietnamese forces. This is referred to as the Fall of Saigon. By 1976, North and South Vietnam were united into one country. In 1976, Ford ran for re-election, but was defeated by Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter defeated Gerald Ford to become the 39th president. He was president from 1977 to 1981. He created new cabinets like the Department of Energy and the Department of Education, established a national energy policy that would include the conservation of energy, and also laid emphasis on price controls of oil and new technology. He believed these things should not be used as luxury items, but made accessible to the common man. Jimmy Carter continued. Carter continued with the Panama Canal treaties and the strategic arms limitation talks. He was a staunch supporter of human rights. He negotiated the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt in 1979, the Camp David Accords, and returned the Panama Canal Zone to Panama, which unfortunately many people criticized. He faced several economic problems in the country in the final years of his presidency, such as confusion in Iran and failure to rescue the American hostages from Iran. This showed up fairly detrimentally on his career chart. He lost the subsequent elections to Ronald Reagan, probably because of it. What was the Iranian hostage crisis? Between 1963 and 1979, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran, spent billions of dollars on military weapons. Yet he then lost popular support. Meanwhile, a popular religious nationalist and bitter foe of the United States, the Ayatollah Khomeini, was exiled. The Shah's regime was unable to sustain economic progress and unwilling to expand democratic freedoms, and it collapsed in revolution. On January 16, 1979, the Shah fled Iran, never to return. At this point, the exiled Ayatollah Khomeini returned to Tehran in February of 1979 and whipped popular discontent into a rabid anti-Americanism. When the Shah came to the America for cancer treatment in October, the Ayatollah incited Iranian militants to attack the U.S. Continuing with the Iran hostage crisis, on November 4th, 1979, an angry mob of some 300 to 500 students who called themselves Imam's disciples laid siege to the American embassy in Tehran, Iran, to capture and hold hostage 66 U.S. citizens and diplomats. Women and African Americans were released a short time later. The 51 hostages remained imprisoned for 444 days, with another individual released because of illness midway through the ordeal.